Well, welcome, friends. This is a socially distanced service, recorded service of the Unitarian Church of South Australia, which has existed in various ways, in various places since 1854. I've recorded this using Zoom's video function, and if there is a component of the service you want to skip past, you can always skip forward or go make a cup of tea and pause and come back. But this service comes to you not just in virtual space, but also from the actual land of the Kaurna people, from which our church in South Australia has drawn its life and living these many years. So it's fitting that we make space to acknowledge and pay our respects to Kaurna elders past, present, and emerging, recognizing that this land is theirs from a long time ago. It's never been ceded and is of continuing spiritual importance to the living Kaurna people today. Well, in that same spirit of welcome and inclusion, SA Unitarian services are intended to serve the spiritual needs of all, as far as that's possible. We are essentially religious pluralists. It should not matter what God or gods you believe in or don't, or are still wondering about. It should not matter what faith tradition or traditions you adhere to, or whether you have adhered to any ever at all. These services serve you by lifting up things of worth, human worth. And that is why we call these services worship, from the Old English worthship, which means to raise something to worth. And offering worship, as we're doing through YouTube to all, is always an act of love and of faith and of hope. And I hope to see you at 11:30 Australian Central Time today for our Zoom coffee hour catch-up. If you are watching and you're not on our email list and don't have an invitation to that Zoom coffee, please contact us at this email address, and we'll make sure to send you an invite to the coffee hour. All are welcome. As indeed, you are welcome to follow our regular podcasts, available on Apple iTunes, follow our Facebook page, our Twitter stream, and visit our webpage, our home webpage, where you will find a range of archived multimedia services. Now, if you don't have a candle or a chalice handy, I'm lucky enough to have this one, hit pause and go get one or make one. A tea light in a cocktail glass or a wine glass or saucer will do. I'll still be here when you get back and hit play again, and we can light our lights together. So here we go. These words by my colleague, Reverend Barnaby Fader. We kindle this flame we trust will lead us forward as we travel into the unknown, where the question, shall I ever get there, resounds, a clear, pure note in every silence. Well, if you've got young ones watching, I've got a traditional wisdom story for you that pertains to today's theme. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. You may know it. And if not, if you're just wanting a good related story to listen to, here goes. This is The Blind Man and the Elephant. Once upon a time in an Indian village, they had never seen an elephant before, but one day an elephant just showed up in the middle of the village, out of nowhere. They didn't know what to think of it, they didn't know how to talk about it, or indeed what sort of a creature it was, or what sort of a thing that it was. So they asked the 6 wise men in their town, very learned, very wise people, but all of whom were unfortunately blind. So they brought them into the square with the elephant, and one of them tripped and fell into the side of the elephant and said, oh, it's very broad and sturdy. So I can tell you this elephant is very like a wall. The second was somewhere else on the elephant and feeling the tusk, round and smooth and sharp. He said, no, it's not like a wall, it's like a spear. The third approached the animal, squirming trunk in his hands, and said, this thick, squirmy thing, it's very like a snake. The fourth was down on his hands and knees and reached out and touched the elephant's leg and put his hands around it and went, oh, this is very thick, like a tree. No, this elephant is not like a spear or a snake or a wall, it's like a tree. And the fifth, who you see on the ladder, scaling the side, touched the ear and said, oh, this elephant, whatever this is, it's very like a fan that we fan ourselves with. It's not like a tree or a snake or a spear or a wall. It's like a fan. Well, the sixth no sooner had begun to speak when he suddenly sees the tail. And he said, this tail with this frayed bit at the end, this is thin and frayed at the end. It's very like a rope. It's not like a fan or a tree or a snake or a spear or a scythe. It's like a rope. And the others said, no, it's a wall. No, it's like a spear. No, it's like this. So they began to argue. And the argument got quite heated. I mean, they were all right. They were all right. The spear is very, tusk is very like a spear. Trunk is very like a snake. Leg is very like a tree. And the argument got heated. And it came to blows. And the blind men, being old, eventually swinging wildly, tired themselves out and slumped down on the ground to rest. The elephant, meanwhile, picked his way carefully around the men and moved back into the forest. What you may want to discuss with your young'uns after this is that the problem with this story is that we think we're the narrator. We know it's an elephant because the narrator tells us it's an elephant, but the blind men don't know. But the fact is, we are all much more like the blind man or the blind men than the elephant. Something you may want to talk about later. I wanted to explore with you today, very briefly, something that's been an absolutely crucial feature of spiritual life for all time. It's been talked about in many ways. It's been experienced and represented in many ways, but we Unitarians seldom speak of it. I want you to have a look at this very short video from this very enthusiastic young man.
Throughout much of human history, sages have spoken about the mystical experience, perhaps the most meaningful experience that human beings are capable of having. The mystical experience is an encounter with the transcendent, right? It's an encounter with the numinous, what Otto Rank described as the mysterium tremendum of reality, when the doors of perception are cleansed. And the mystical experience has some characteristics, some persistent hallmarks that always show up, no matter the culture or worldview and belief system of whoever is having it. So there's these common attributes that show up with mystical experiences. They are the following. The mystical experience is characterized by feelings of cosmic unity, feelings of oneness with everything, feelings of interconnection. The mystical experience is characterized by feelings of transcendent time and space. The mind freed from the shackles of the ego, freed from the constraints of time and space. The mystical experience is characterized by positive mood lifting, right? A feeling of bliss, a feeling of ecstasy, a feeling of gratitude, right? Pure magic. The mystical experience is characterized by feelings of the secret, of connecting with the divine. The mystical experience is characterized by ineffability. You can't quite put it into words. It's an experience beyond language. You can't clothe it with language. The mystical experience is characterized by feelings of paradoxicality, feelings where you hold multiple perspectives of mind at once, where contradictions are reconciled, where you can conceive of opposites and somehow hold them in mind at once. The mystical experience is characterized by its fleeting quality. It's something that can emerge, can dissolve just as quickly. It's a finite experience. A mystical experience is characterized by feelings of transformative change that are lasting. So even though it's a temporary experience, a person is forever transformed. New perspectives are eclipsed. New visionary understanding is felt. And so a person is forever made better. A person feels like they've seen the light, whereas once we were blind, now we can see. And finally, mystical experience leaves us with a quality of an noetic flavor, right? There's this sense that what we've seen and what was understood and what was felt has some deeper veracity than everyday reality, has some kind of deeper meaning beyond our normal literal grid. There's a sense that there is ultimate truth, meaning to what was absolute, and this lasts indefinitely. So these are the hallmarks of a mystical experience, something that as human beings we should all aim to encounter at least once in Because, as David Foster Wallace wrote, the alternative is unconscious, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing.
I wanted to share that with you because I literally can't describe it any better than that. That's a very comprehensive and exact 2-minute definition of something that is beyond definition, the mystical experience, which is, as we might imagine, crucial to sort of religious understanding. Have you ever had one? And if you haven't, if you ought to try to. Have you had this sense of, wonderment that you can't explain, but that changes forever how you see things? Now, there's no question this sort of experience happens to people all the time and has. And it has religious or spiritual significance, the transcendental experience, the mystical experience, the one described by saints, prophets, sages, poets, and has been reported throughout human history. It stands in a stark contrast to our everyday prosaic, materialist, pedestrian ways of engaging the world. Famous examples abound. Socrates heard a still small voice at the back of his head. Joan of Arc heard voices that she took to be the commands of God. Van Gogh had not so much sounds, but pictures, saw through mundane reality into the vast energy fields beneath it. Romantic poets, too, wrote of a sense of ineffable interconnectedness while they were in untamed places in nature. Artists used to speak of a visitation from a pagan goddess called the MUSE, who would descend and give you an enlightenment and awareness that was out of the ordinary. I mean, the Quran was, by report, dictated to Muhammad from God himself. And as you remember from Christian tradition, the Holy Spirit came down and knocked St. Paul off his horse, and he created Christianity. So it was profound. So sometimes the mystical experience just happens to you, but you can also induce it by working hard at some spiritual practice like ritual dance or meditating, chanting, or praying. One time when I was traveling in northern Greece, I saw a small village's feast day of St. Gregory, where the devotees dance all day to incessant music while gazing at a picture of the saint. And then to prove how transformed, it's like a rave, to prove how transformed they are, which they call touched by the saint. They dance on hot coals. The soles of their feet were not burned. Maybe there was a trick to it. I saw this with my own eyes. In the 60s and 70s, we tried to hack these mystical experiences by busting open the doors of our perception with psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, peyote, mescaline, ayahuasca. Such famous names as Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, and Terence McKenna wanted to tear through the veil of appearances, many of them using natural substances traditional cultures have been using for ages, to remind them that there is more to creation that can fit through the narrow portals of our eyes and ears. I grew up steeped in religion, but lacking any experience like this. So I wanted that divine encounter everybody talked about. I want to see God directly in the face. So when I was old enough to score, I tripped a lot. And I had some mind-expanding experiences that changed my perception forever. Now, does that mean I lost my senses, or had I just come to them? I ask this because I think some kind of mystical experience is the only reason people go into religious ministry. And they don't tell you this because they don't want to be thought insane, but it is the truth. It's called getting the call. And it's happened to me twice. The first was about 15 years ago when I was recovering from a major depressive illness, not, by the way, a coincidence. Not coincidentally. It was not like a trumpet call so much as like the sound of the neighbor's radio playing persistently through a wall. You can barely hear it. So you strain to listen because it's so different to what you're listening to. You naturally doubt it as much as you're transfixed by it. So there's this paradox. You're transfixed by this experience, but also really doubting that you're having it. This poem by Louis MacNeice catches this paradox of having and doubting such experiences as of a visitation from the muse or a mystical experience, and it's today's reading. The gull, hundreds of miles below him, was it the muse? The cloud, thousands of miles above him, was it the muse? The river intoning his saga over and over, the siren blaring her long farewell to Dover, the grasshopper snipping scissors in the clover. Were they the muse or no? So those who carry this birthright and this burden, regardless of all else, must always listen. On the odd chance some fact or freak or phantom might tell them what they want, might burst the cordon which isolates them from their inmost vision. The cradle, thousands of years behind him, was it the muse? The coffin, a headstone's throw before him, is it the muse? The clock that is ever impeding, ever abetting, the bed that is ever remembering, ever forgetting, the sun ever rising and setting, unrising, unsetting. Are they the muse or no? So those endowed with such a doom and heirloom, when others can be carefree, must be careful. And though sometimes when the rest are careful, carefree, must wait for the unimmediately apparent and grasp the immediate, fairly or unfairly. The world, 1 millimeter beyond him, is it the muse? The soul, untold light years inside him, is it the muse? The python of the past with coils unending, the lion of the present roaring, rending, the gray dove of the future still descending. Are they the muse or no? The second call I had was different, where the first was like a radio in a neighbor's house. This one was more like sitting in front of a booming symphony orchestra. I didn't pursue this one as I did the last. This one I tried to run from. It was basically what I took to be the God of my understanding directing me to put my faith and energies into the children, into school chaplaincy. It took about 20 minutes of a warm December afternoon at my house last December and featured a full-on tearful shouting match with the divine, who had all the answers to my craven evasions and anger. I mean, I won't detail it here, but basically the message was a command. This is what you must do now, and you must go full bore, and you must hold nothing back, because they need someone your age to tell them the truth, no matter the cost. Now, was this call a religious mystical experience, a revelation of truth, or was I having a psychotic event? A symptom of a vulnerable mind and a torn in a turmoil of inner conflict. You know, mystical experience and mental events and mental illness are hard to distinguish. The similarity between religious visions and hallucinations of people with mental illness has long been known. Numerous mental conditions are associated with producing mystical experiences, including bipolar, schizophrenia, epilepsy. Schizophrenia, for example, is a complex mental event that is far from understood. Features include a disconnect with everyday perceptions of reality, visual and auditory hallucinations. They often hallucinate commanding voices that instruct them what to do. The voices are as sensorily real to them as when someone talks to you, and are like how religious visions are described. I mean, Joan of Arc, for example, in the previous slide, for instance, heard commanding voices as she heard as messages from God. Now, history, of course, subsequently attempts to rationalize it with guesses about her. Well, she was maybe schizophrenic, or she had epilepsy, or she was bipolar, or one historian speculated that she had bovine tuberculosis from drinking unpasteurized milk. Schizophrenia is often framed as some sort of deficit model that may involve areas of the brain being damaged or underdeveloped or deteriorated. But maybe such mental events are more normal than we think, and we've learned to rationalize and marginalize them. There was a seminal book years back, Julian Jaynes' The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Princeton University psychologist Julian Jaynes theorized that such mental events were just earlier ways of thinking for humans, a vestige of pre-conscious human thinking. The commanding voice of schizophrenic here as early gods, or experienced as God in MUSE, like in sight or sound, like the burning bush for Moses. It's the right hemisphere, the emotional, intuitive, holistic side of the brain, much less dominant now than it used to be, because the left hemisphere, cognitive, rational, linguistic parts of the brain have gained more influence. The cognitive and the emotional parts have evolved only laterally to work interconnectedly and seamlessly together, but the bicamera, the two rooms, have not always been so interconnected. The left hemisphere's cognitive structuring with advanced language labels, categorizes, and uses symbols to process holistic right hemisphere messages to make sense of it. As early humans lacked the ability to think about their own thoughts, they thus received messages without the conscious cognitive analysis, without, in short, the left hemisphere interpreting messages from the right. Jaynes said humans thus received messages and took them as direct commands and powers from powers outside themselves, gods, spirits, muses, dead ancestors, and so on. When early people literally perceived and heard gods and muses, it was their brain talking to itself, but they did not have the conscious ability to know it was their own thoughts. Jaynes says this early way of thinking was useful and for social functioning and survival in the early days of consciousness. We didn't have the cognitive structures to interpret the world, so we had instinct. What we think of as consciousness now is the ability to think about our thinking and be aware that they are our own thoughts. As our own social complexity increased, our cognitive structures changed with advanced written and spoken language, and self-reflection developed. So these religious feeling voices, visions, diminished or disappeared from people's everyday life. Gods, muses, or spirits, once part of everyday awareness. There were little gods of everything, gradually disappeared. No wonder we feel like we've had and lost some infinitely precious thing. This is why the mystical experience described in records like the Bible no longer seem to be happening for most of the time for most of us, but they still do happen. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. The benevolent angel who walked by my side has departed. My protecting spirit has taken flight and is seeking someone else. Words of an anonymous Mesopotamian poet. But how much does that sound like one of the Psalms of David, one of the laments, Psalms of David in the Bible? My God, why have you forsaken us? As unified consciousness developed and the gods disappeared, humans felt that their gods had left them. And so they developed religious practices and leaders in attempt to bring them back. So practices such as, meditation, Gregorian chanting, whirling dervishes is in this picture, sun dances and meditation, prayer, all of these things are meant to alter how the mind functions by suppressing the left hemisphere rational parts of the brain. They bring us back closer to that early thinking, the mystical way of thinking. And so my point here is that mystical thinking is in a way natural to all of us. And in early society, shamans and similar mystics were people whose brains still worked well in that old way. And so societies used them as conduits to the gods. You see it today in very young children who are more attuned to the mystical, precisely because their brains are less interconnected. I mean, as a child, I very clearly remember seeing the beech tree outside my window ablaze with angels. Well, my parents, of course, couldn't and talked me out of it. We're not amused, but how quickly we acculturate children to see the world precisely as we see it. Schizophrenic Nobel Prize-winning mathematician John Nash, he of the film A Beautiful Mind, said he got his hallucinations and delusions to go away by thinking about them logically and logically dismissing them as hallucinations. But that shows our consciousness is and always will be a construct, and therefore always a bit false. We are capable of other ways of experiencing a reality bigger and more complicated than the lenses we see with. Schizophrenic delusions and hallucinations usually have some sort of religious content. Most schizophrenics have a definite idea and a belief in God, but this is also true that culture influences the types of mystical experiences have. Schizophrenics in these studies with no religious upbringing more commonly interpret voices, not as coming from God, but as from family members or from aliens, or they have delusions that the government is somehow radio signaling their brain and they're being persecuted. Now, I can't say I've ever had that, nor in the battery of psychological tests I recently took for UUA accreditation was I pronounced anything but psychologically normal. How depressing, actually. But if I was truly mad, would I even know that I was? Do the mad know that they're mad? These calls I had from God or from the right hemisphere of my brain did happen, are undeniable, so much so that I have made totally irrational changes to my life based on the illumination they provided. Are what we've come to call religious or mystical experiences then just psychotic episodes? Well, the liberal religious answer to such questions is never either or, never either religious experience or a psychotic episode, but both and. This is the both and answer is a humble answer, suggesting that both things are possible and that our way of understanding the world can never be comprehensive, exclusive, or settled. And that perhaps pathologizing such experiences is not helpful to us, not helpful to our spiritual growth. That there will indeed always be more in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in the current constructed phase of our evolving consciousness. I have lived the mysterious nature of my calling as if it were true, as if it were directly from beyond, and as if there is more than this prosaic reality. And look, I haven't robbed anyone, I haven't raped anyone, I haven't killed anyone, I haven't lost a house, a job, a wife, a partner. I have laughed my head off and gone about my day singing. I haven't hurt myself or anyone else by those decisions. Following those calls made my life richer and the world more wonderful. I wish you too that type of madness. I'll leave you with a blessing from my colleague Mary Eads. Like the cosmic dust flowing after a great Perseid meteor, we are the shining remnants of time and all that has come to pass in its wake, briefly shining lights on the way to eternity. We're only visible to the naked eye for an instant. So take this moment to shine like the stardust you are. May the light of your time on earth shine and bless the world and all others you come in contact with. So shine. Amen. Thank you for your attention through this video. We'll hope to see you at the Zoom coffee hour. If not, we'll see you next time one of these are uploaded. Thanks very much. See you later.